Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something really fascinating. The world inside a honeybee's head. Their senses, their smarts. It's quite something.
It really is. We've got some great source material here looking at their neuroethology, their cognitive science, basically how their brains are built to let them see, smell, learn, navigate, all of it.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to get a feel for what it's like to be a bee. So our mission today is to pull out the really key stuff from this research. How do they see colors we can't? How do they, measure distance just by watching the world fly by?
Right, and how they find their way home, keep track of time, even sense magnetic fields. It's about understanding the practical genius behind what they do every day.
It really makes you look at them differently, doesn't it? Not just little fuzzy things buzzing around.
Definitely. There's a lot going on in there.
Okay, so where should we start? Vision seems like the obvious place, how they see the world. And the history there goes way back, right? To von Frisch.
Absolutely. Carl von Frisch, a Nobel laureate, he did those classic experiments with colored cards that proved bees weren't just seeing shades of gray, they were actually responding to specific colors. That was foundational.
And then others built on that.
Yeah, people like Kuhn showed they could see ultraviolet light totally invisible to us, and Dahmer figured out they're trichromats.
Like humans, we have 3 color receptors too.
Similar concept, yeah, but different receptors. We've got red, green, and blue cones. Bees have peaks for UV, blue, and green light.
Okay, so a different slice of the spectrum. What does that mean practically? Like, how sharp is their vision, their acuity?
Well, it comes down to the compound eye structure, those individual units called ommatidia. Think of them like pixels. You've got the acceptance angle, how big an area each pixel sees, and the interommatidial angle, which is how they're spaced out.
So what's the bottom line? How clear is the picture?
Okay, so the best estimates, theoretically and from tests, put their maximum resolution around 1.6 degrees. Now, compare that to us. Our vision is something like 100 times sharper.
100 times. Wow.
Yeah. The sources use a great analogy. The full moon is about half a degree wide. So the finest detail a bee can resolve is like looking at a patch of sky 3 full moons wide by 3 full moons high.
That's incredibly blurry compared to what we see.
It is. It's not about picking out fine details at a distance. Although, interestingly, for using the sun as a compass point, which we'll get to, they probably only need 1 ommatidium to lock onto it.
Right, so detail isn't the key thing. But what about speed? How fast can they process what they do see, especially flying around?
Now that's where they excel. There's something called the critical fusion frequency, CFF. It's basically the fastest flicker rate the eye can detect before it just looks like steady light.
Okay.
For bees, the CFF is incredibly high, somewhere between 165 and 300 hertz. Compare that to mammals, including us, we're down around 30 to 70 hertz.
Whoa, that's a huge difference.
It means they see the world updating, like 5 or 6 times faster than we do. So when they're flying fast, things don't blur into streaks the way they would for us. It's essential for dodging obstacles and navigating quickly.
Makes total sense for an insect zipping around flowers. And their field of view, pretty wide.
Almost 360 degrees, just a tiny blind spot right behind them. But their binocular vision, where the fields overlap for depth, is really narrow, only good for a few centimeters right in front.
And they don't see well in the dark.
No, very poor night vision. That compound eye structure and the way pigments screen light just doesn't work well in dim conditions. Strictly daytime operators.
Okay, back to color for a sec. The UV vision, what's the big advantage?
It's huge for finding flowers. Many flowers that look plain to us have these amazing patterns, nectar guides, that only show up in UV.
Like runway lights for bees.
Exactly. High contrast patterns saying nectar this way. The sources have pictures showing this a flower in visible light versus UV. It's a totally different look. And you mentioned polarized light earlier. That's another visual trick they have for navigation. We'll definitely circle back to that.
All right, so let's tackle the big one. Can bees see red?
Yes. It's nuanced, not a simple yes or no. The source material lays it out well. First off, many red flowers in nature also reflect some UV or blue light, which bees can definitely see.
Okay, so they might be seeing the blue component, not the red.
Right. Second, their green photoreceptor actually has some sensitivity that creeps into the orange and orangish red part of the spectrum. Maybe 50% sensitivity around 595 nanometers, down to maybe 10% at 640 nanometers.
So they can detect light in that range.
They can detect its presence, its brightness. But here's the crucial bit. In that red range, there's no other receptor type that overlaps significantly. Meaning they can tell if there's light there and how bright it is, but they can't compare signals from different receptors to figure out the specific wavelength or color. They can't distinguish a bright orange red from a dimmer deep red based purely on hue.
Got it. So they sense brightness in that
Yeah.
frequency, but they don't perceive red as a distinct color like we do.
Precisely. It's like seeing things in grayscale. For us, you detect light intensity, but not color information. And even for flowers that are purely red, reflecting nothing else bees can see, they can still spot them as dark shapes against, say, a green leafy background.
So they can find red flowers, just not by seeing redness.
Exactly. Their visual world is just fundamentally different.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, so they have this unique way of seeing. How do they learn from what they see? How do they figure out which flower is worth visiting or how to recognize a landmark?
Visual learning is a massive field for bees. We know they learn colors pretty quickly, especially blues, which makes sense given flowers. And they show color constancy. They recognize a color even if the lighting changes.
But studying patterns, black and white shapes, that helped figure out the how.
Yeah, looking at achromatic patterns, simple shapes, helped researchers control things better. Early work, von Frisch again, and Hertz trained bees to patterns under feeders. But a limitation was the bees could approach from any angle.
Which matters for a compound eye.
Right. Later work, like by Wiener and Lindauer, used vertical screens, so the bees approached head-on. They showed bees could learn patterns often found in flowers, things with radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry.
And they noticed bees hovering before landing.
Yes, that observation led to the idea of bees taking visual snapshots. They seem to pause, look, and maybe compare what they see to a memorized image. At this stage, the learning seemed quite rigid, almost like rote memorization of that specific pattern.
But could they generalize, learn the idea of symmetry, not just one symmetrical shape?
That was the next big question. Weiner did a key study with angled bars. Bees trained to a bar tilted at one angle could then recognize bars at similar angles, even if they were different sizes or colors.
So they learn the orientation itself.
Exactly. That opened the floodgates. Lots of studies confirmed bees can generalize. They can learn the concept of symmetry, different spatial arrangements like a solid disk versus a ring, and generalize color and size cues too.
So they're pulling out features, rules, not just memorizing pictures.
Mm-hmm.
What about harder visual tasks? Abstract stuff.
Well, they initially had trouble with things like finding camouflaged patterns, but then Zhang and Srinivasan did this really clever study. They found if you trained bees to recognize a shape against a plain white background first, they got much better at finding that same shape later when it was hidden against a complex camouflaged background.
So learning the easy version first helped them crack the hard version.
Yeah, it showed that prior experience really shapes their ability to learn more complex things. It's not fixed.
What else can they do? Mazes?
Yep. They can learn paths through simple mazes using visual landmarks. Takes them maybe 20 trials or so, and their short-term visual memory is pretty good. They can hold an image in mind and compare it to what they're seeing, even generalizing across different colors or patterns. They can even link pairs of images, like learning A goes with B and C goes with D.
And combine senses, like smell and sight in a maze.
Yes, they can integrate information across senses, which is quite sophisticated, using both an odor cue and a visual landmark to solve a maze, for instance.
Okay, what about quantity? Can bees count?
Ah, the counting question. There's some really intriguing evidence suggesting they have a sense of quantity, but exactly what that means is still debated. Some studies, like Dak and Srinivasan's, had bees flying down tunnels and suggested they could remember the order of up to 4 landmarks.
Or again, that number keeps popping up.
It does. And other work by Gross and colleagues tested if bees could match the number of items, like choosing a display with 3 dots after seeing a sample with 3 dots. They seem to manage up to 4 items there, too.
So is it actual counting, like 1, 2, 3, 4? Or just more versus less?
That's the million-dollar question. Are they processing discrete numbers, or are they judging continuous magnitude like the overall area or density of items? The sources make it clear this is still an active area of research, trying to figure out if it's true symbolic number sense or something else.
Fascinating. Let's pivot from sight to smell. Another area where von Frisch was a trailblazer, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He just adapted his sugar reward training method, showed bees could quickly learn to associate specific odors with food, tell apart many different smells, remember them for a long time, and even generalize recognizing odors similar to ones they'd learned.
And nowadays, the go-to method is the PER paradigm, proboscis extension response.
Exactly. It leverages a really simple built-in reflex. If you touch a hungry bee's antenna or mouth parts with sugar water, it automatically sticks out its proboscis, its tongue, to drink.
Like a little Pavlovian response already built in?
Right. So the PER paradigm takes that reflex and uses it for classic conditioning. You pair a neutral smell, the conditioned stimulus, CS, with the sugar reward, the unconditioned stimulus, US.
And eventually the smell alone triggers the tongue thing.
Precisely. After enough pairings, the bee anticipates the reward just from the smell and extends its proboscis. Kuwabara first did this with color cues, then Takeda adapted it for odors in the 70s.
And Takeda found complex learning.
Yeah, he showed bees could do things like extinction, stop responding when the reward stops, conditioned inhibition, learning a smell predicts no reward, even second-order conditioning, things we typically associate with vertebrate learning.
And then Bitterman solidified it.
Yes, Bitterman's group later standardized the whole protocol, did careful control experiments to make sure it was truly Pavlovian associative learning, not just the bee getting generally excited. That really set the stage for decades of research using PER. You can see a picture of a bee in the setup in figure 7.4 in the source material.
So using this tool, what did we learn about how well bees can smell? How fine-tuned is it?
Well, lots of PER studies mapped out their ability to discriminate between odors and generalize to similar ones. Researchers like Vareschi and Laska and Menzel found bees often categorize smells based on chemical features, like the functional group or the length of the carbon chain in the molecule.
So similar structures smell similar to them?
Generally, yes. A big study by Gary Airy and colleagues looked at lots of compounds and found it's complex. Sometimes bees treat very similar chemicals differently, but overall carbon chain length seemed to be one of the best predictors for how they generalize.
And since they pollinate flowers, floral scents must be really important.
Hugely important ecologically, so a lot of research focuses on complex floral blends. This led to the idea of key components. Maybe one or two specific chemicals in a mix that are disproportionately important for attracting the bee or helping it recognize the flower.
Do you know why some compounds are key?
Not really. It's not just about which chemical is strongest or evaporates fastest. Concentration matters, sure, but structure alone doesn't fully explain it. Maybe more unique or distinctive odors within a blend stand out more. It's also possible that complex natural blends are actually processed more efficiently by their olfactory system than single, pure chemicals. Still lots to figure out there.
Okay, moving from senses to action navigation. It's just mind-boggling how they find their way back to a tiny hive inference from maybe miles away.
It truly is one of their most impressive feats. And it starts early with those orientation flights young bees take before they even start foraging.
Right, you mentioned those. They fly in arcs.
Yeah, increasing arcs, moving further from the hive, but always turning back to face the entrance. What they're doing is learning the visual scene, the landmarks, right around the nest.
Like building a little local map.
Exactly. There was a study by Dejan et al., where they captured bees right after these flights. Bees released inside the area they'd flown over went straight home. Bees released just outside that area. They got lost. Experienced foragers will do the same thing if you move the whole hive, they reorient.
So knowing the local area is critical? But what about further out? We're flying over totally new ground.
That's where path integration comes in, or dead reckoning. This is an internal system that keeps track of how far you've gone and in what directions you've turned relative to your starting point.
Like navigating by internal compass and odometer.
Pretty much. It constantly calculates a home vector, the straight line direction and distance back to the start. It works even without seeing any familiar landmarks.
Isn't that what those desert ants are famous for?
Exactly. Cataglyphis ants are the classic example. If you move them while they're out, they'll run the vector that would have gotten them home from where they thought they were. Bees absolutely use path integration, but they seem to rely on landmarks more than those ants do.
Okay, so for path integration, they need direction and distance. How do they get direction?
The primary way is the sun compass. But it's not just fly towards the sun, it's time compensated. They know where the sun should be at different times of day and adjust accordingly.
How do we know that?
Classic clock shifting experiments. Researchers messed with the bees' internal clocks, making them think it was earlier or later than it really was. When released, the bees flew off at an angle relative to the sun that was precisely wrong based on their internal clock's time, but correct if you assumed they were using the sun's position. They primarily used the sun's azimuth, its position along the horizon.
What if it's cloudy? No sun visible.
That's where polarized light comes in. Bees can see the pattern of polarized light in the blue sky, which is directly related to the sun's position, even if the sun itself is hidden. Von Frisch showed they only needed a tiny patch of blue sky, like 15 degrees across, to navigate. If you put a polarizing filter over that patch and rotated it, their dance angles changed.
So they use both sun and polarized light.
Yes, studies show they use them together. They seem to prefer the sun. If it's available, it's a stronger signal. But if the sun is obscured or the signal is weak, they rely heavily on the polarized light pattern.
Okay, that covers direction. How do they measure the distance traveled for path integration?
This is really cool. They use optic flow. It's the apparent motion of the visual world across the retinas as they fly forward. The faster things seem to stream past, the faster they perceive they're moving, and the more distance they calculate they've covered.
And there were experiments in tunnels to prove this, with stripes.
Yes, brilliant experiments. Figure 7.3 in the sources shows this. Bees flew down a tunnel to a feeder. If the tunnel walls had vertical stripes, that creates a lot of side-to-side optic flow as they fly. They'd come back and do a waggle dance indicating a certain distance.
Oh.
But if the walls had horizontal stripes, which run parallel to their flight path, there's almost no optic flow. After flying down that tunnel, the bees came back and performed a round dance, indicating the food was very close, even though they flew the same actual distance and spent the same time and energy.
Wow. So it's purely the visual flow telling them how far they've gone.
Yeah.
Incredible.
It really is. Now, path integration isn't perfectly simple. There's a wrinkle. If a bee has to fly a detour, say, around a big building,
Okay.
the direction it signals in its waggle dance back at the hive is the straight line direction home, the path integration vector.
Mm-hmm.
But the distance it signals often includes the extra length of the detour it flew.
Huh. That seems contradictory. Why would direction be the beeline, but distance include the detour?
Yeah, it's puzzled researchers. One idea is maybe there are separate integration systems for direction and distance. Another is that the system is flexible, maybe incorporating the detour distance because that's the actual path needed to get the food, even if as the crow flies, direction is different. It's not fully resolved.
Okay, so path integration is one piece. But bees clearly use landmarks too. This leads us to non-egocentric navigation, knowing where you are based on the world, not just your own movements. And the big debate, image matching versus a true cognitive map.
Exactly. Image matching is the idea that bees store visual snapshots of important places, the hive entrance, a good patch of flowers. Then they compare their current view to these stored templates to guide their flight.
And there are different kinds.
Researchers talk about two main types. Alignment matching uses distant cues, like the overall skyline or panorama. By matching the current wide view to a stored one, the bee can orient itself, especially useful for setting off in the right general direction over longer distances.
Was that hard to prove in bees?
Initially, yes, the evidence was a bit patchy, but more recent studies, like ones using artificial rotatable skylines, have shown pretty convincingly that bees do use the panoramic skyline to get their bearings. If you rotate the learned skyline, their departure direction changes accordingly.
Okay, so panorama matching was the other type.
Position matching. This uses nearby objects. Close to a target, like the nest entrance, the image of landmarks changes size and position on the bee's retina very quickly as it moves. By matching the current view of these close objects to a stored snapshot taken from the goal location, the bee can pinpoint its position very accurately.
This sounds like Tinbergen's digger wasps and the pine cones.
Exactly the same inspiration. Collette and others really developed this idea for bees. They did experiments in visually simple environments, like a white room with just one black cylinder as a landmark.
And what did they find?
They found bees trained to find a reward near the cylinder would search in the correct relative position. And crucially, if you made the cylinder landmark bigger or smaller between trials, the bees adjusted their search distance, searching further away from a bigger cylinder and closer to a smaller one.
Consistent with matching the landmark's size on their retina from a stored snapshot.
Precisely. It suggests they store the expected view from the goal and try to make their current view match it. To make this work well, especially for landing, bees often seem to approach targets from preferred directions, maybe simplifying the matching process. Researchers also talk about the catchment area, the zone around a target where a particular snapshot is useful, and motion parallax, how closer objects seem to move faster than distant ones, as the bee flies likely provides extra depth information too.
Okay, so image matching, using stored snapshots of near and far views, seems pretty well established. But the cognitive map idea, That's a whole different level, right?
Yes, a cognitive map implies something more abstract. It's like having a mental representation of the environment where, the spatial relationships between different landmarks, not just how they look from one spot or how to get back to the hive from them. It's the kind of map that would let you figure out a novel shortcut between two known places, even if you've never flown that specific route before.
Which we know animals like rats can do, but in bees.
Controversial? Highly controversial, and very difficult to prove definitively in insects. A big breakthrough was harmonic radar, which finally allowed researchers like Menzel's group to actually track individual bee flight paths over long distances.
And what did those tracking studies show?
They showed something interesting. If you capture a bee at a feeder and release it somewhere else, it often first flies off in the direction of its path integration vector, the direction back home. But if that doesn't work, it starts searching. If it then stumbles upon a landmark it recognizes, it often flies directly home from that landmark, even if it's never flown that specific path before.
Okay, so that could mean one of two things.
Right. Interpretation 1. The bee has simply memorized a specific home vector from every single landmark it knows, like a big list of directions. Interpretation 2. The bee has a more flexible map sense, allowing it to calculate the route home from any known location.
So the key was finding evidence of bees flying novel routes, not just towards home.
Exactly. Could they fly directly from, say, feeder A to feeder B if they'd only ever flown hive to A and hive to B? Some studies suggested they could. For example, bees might fly from an old feeder site, A, directly to a new one, B after learning B's location from a dance, even though they'd never flown A to B.
But couldn't that still be explained by vectors? Like flying the vector from A back towards the hive, then adding the vector from the hive to B, a sort of mental triangle calculation.
That was the counter-argument. It could potentially be explained by vector addition via the hive without needing a true map. So Menzel's group tried a more definitive experiment using clock shifting.
The idea being that vector calculations rely on the sun compass, which needs a working clock.
That was the logic. If you mess up the bee's clock, it shouldn't be able to calculate vectors accurately, especially complex ones involving the hive as an intermediate point. They used anesthesia, which can disrupt the clock's role in this kind of navigation.
And what happened in that experiment?
They did it in a place where they argued the distant skyline wasn't informative enough for simple panorama matching. Control bees, when displaced, flew their initial home vector, searched a bit, then flew straight home. The clock-shifted bees, as expected, initially flew off in the wrong direction because their sun compass was messed up, but after searching, they also flew straight home and, crucially, took about the same amount of time as the controls once they started heading home.
So Menzel's conclusion was?
Their interpretation was that the clock-shifted bees must have been using local landmarks combined with some kind of map sense to find their way home because their sun compass wasn't reliable for vector calculations, and they argued panorama matching wasn't sufficient in that setup.
But this is where the debate really kicks in.
Yes. Critics argued that maybe the panoramic cues were sufficient after all, or questioned whether the clock-shifting method truly knocked out vector calculation in the way assumed. The source material flags this as an ongoing debate. Key questions remain. What about other senses, like magnetism? Could the two-path integrator's idea explain some results? And crucially, can bees plot a novel route between 2 points, neither of which is the hive, without a functional clock? That experiment hasn't really been done.
So the verdict on a bee cognitive map is still out. A tantalizing possibility, but not proven.
Exactly. It remains one of the most exciting and challenging questions in insect cognition.
Okay, let's shift to another amazing capability. Their sense of time. Circadian rhythms, internal clocks. They're crucial for bees, aren't they?
Absolutely fundamental. Like most animals, bees have internal biological clocks that regulate daily cycles of sleep and activity. And many specific behaviors are timed. Queen mating flights, drone flights, even those first orientation flights of young workers tend to happen at particular times of day.
And the clock is needed for the sun compass navigation we talked about.
Yes, essential for calibrating it as the sun moves across the sky. But they also use timekeeping in a really sophisticated way for foraging.
How so?
Individual foragers can learn and remember the specific times of day when different flower patches offer the most nectar or pollen. Coulterman showed they could keep track of up to 9 different time-place associations. If a certain flower only opens at 2 p.m., the bee learns to show up then. It's a derived time sense, specifically for optimizing food collection.
That's incredible scheduling.
Yeah.
What else do we know about their daily rhythms?
Well, studies looking at the bees themselves, their phenotype, show rhythms at the individual and colony level. But one of the most fascinating findings relates to age and task. Very young nurse bees tending the brood in the dark hive show almost no daily rhythm in their activity.
They're just always on call.
Pretty much. Middle-aged bees doing tasks inside the hive start showing a moderate rhythm. But the foragers, flying outside in the day-night cycle, they develop a very strong, clear circadian rhythm.
And this led to more research by Bloch and others.
Yes, Bloch's lab followed up extensively. They showed if you force a forager to revert back to nursing duties, she loses that strong rhythm again, suggesting its adaptive nurses benefit from being arrhythmic. And they found it wasn't just being inside or outside. Forcing young bees to forage early didn't automatically give them a strong rhythm.
So what was controlling the rhythm, especially nurses?
The key discovery was the brood itself. The presence of larvae and pupa emits social cues that actively dampen the circadian rhythms of the nurse bees tending them.
Wow, the babies control the nurses' clocks.
In effect, yes. If you take young bees and keep them with brood, they stay arrhythmic. Take away the brood. They quickly develop a strong daily rhythm, even in constant darkness. Figure 7.5 shows this effect clearly.
So social cues override the internal clock or the light cycle.
They seem to be dominant, yes. Other studies show that if you put social cues, like hive activity, out of sync with the external light-dark cycle, the bees will entrain more strongly to the social cues. These cues are probably things like vibrations through the comb or maybe pheromones.
Okay, so that's the behavior. What about the mechanism, the actual clock genes inside the cells? Was the clock just turned off in nurses?
That was the initial thought. Early studies looked at the main clock gene, called period, in whole bee brains. They saw its levels cycling nicely in foragers but flat in nurses. So the hypothesis was nurse clock is off.
But then conflicting data came up.
Yes. A big transcriptomic study looking at all gene activity found over 160 genes cycling on a daily basis in nurses. That suggested a functional clock was running. Plus, the observation that nurses removed from the hive do become rhythmic and entrained to light-dark cycles. It didn't quite add up.
So how was this contradiction resolved?
A really elegant study by Fuchikawa and colleagues used antibodies to specifically label the neurons where the core clock mechanism operates. And they found that in these critical clock neurons, the clock proteins were cycling normally in nurses, just like in foragers.
So the whole brain studies were misleading.
Partly, yes. It turns out the period gene also cycles strongly in glial cells, the support cells in the brain, but only in foragers, not in nurses. So the earlier whole brain signal was likely dominated by this glial cycling in foragers, masking the neuronal cycling that was happening in both castes. Figure 7.6 illustrates these clock protein levels in the neurons.
Ah, okay, so the central clock is ticking in nurses, but its output, its effect on behavior, is somehow blocked or damped by those social cues from the brood.
Exactly. That seems to be the current understanding. The social environment modulates the output of the clock, potentially playing a role in regulating when a bee transitions from being a nurse to a forager. And those glial cells might be unexpectedly important regulators of how the clock's timing signal actually influences behavior.
That's incredibly sophisticated internal regulation. Okay, one last sense to touch on, and it's another one that's alien to us. The magnetic sense. Bees can sense the Earth's magnetic field.
Yes, the evidence is quite solid now. Bees can sense it.
How do we know? What did researchers find?
Some early hints came from Lindauer and Martin, who noticed that artificially changing the magnetic field could slightly alter the orientation of the bees' waggle dances. Good also reported effects of magnetism on how bees build their honeycomb.
And more direct learning tests.
Yes, using the PER paradigm again. Studies by Walker and Bitterman, and later Liang and others, showed bees could be trained to associate a magnetic field of a certain direction or intensity with a sugar reward. They learned to extend their proboscis in response to the magnetic cue, proving they could perceive it.
Okay, they can sense it. Any idea how? Is there a sensor?
The leading hypothesis involves tiny, iron-containing particles found in specialized cells in the bee's abdomen. Good's group first proposed this, and others have identified these particles.
Iron particles acting like tiny compass needles.
Sort of, but the proposed mechanism is a bit different. The idea is that changes in the external magnetic field cause these iron particles to physically move or exert torque within the cell. This tiny movement puts stress on the cell's internal scaffolding, the cytoskeleton.
And that stress is the signal.
That stress is thought to trigger a biochemical response, specifically an influx of calcium ions, Ca2+, into the cell. This change in calcium level would then be the signal that gets passed on to the nervous system. So it's a magneto-mechanical chemical transduction process.
Wow. Okay, let's try to wrap our heads around all this.
Yep.
We've covered their unique vision UV, super fast motion processing, the whole red question,
Their keen sense of smell, the sophisticated ways they learn patterns, and maybe even quantities.
and the incredible navigation toolkit, path integration using the sun, polarized light, optic flow, using landmarks via image matching, and that tantalizing, maybe not cognitive map.
Plus the intricate timekeeping, tuned by social cues, and his magnetic sense. It's just an astonishing suite of abilities packed into that tiny brain.
It really gives you a different perspective, doesn't it? You've just taken a peek into how a honeybee experiences its world, and it's so, so different from ours.
Absolutely. The sensory inputs, the computational strategies, it's a whole other reality.
So thinking about all this, the complexity, the multiple navigation systems, quantity sense, magnetic sense, the social regulation of internal clocks, what else might be going on in there that we haven't even figured out how to ask about yet?
Exactly. What other dimensions of their world, what other capabilities are we still completely missing? And what does it tell us about the potential hidden complexity inside even the smallest minds around us? Definitely something to ponder.